December 25th, 2025, Southern Caribbean Sea. While much of the world was wrapped up in the holiday season, 3 Venezuelan naval vessels began to move. At 3:41 p.m. local time, radar operators aboard a U.S. Navy ship watched the change unfold live. 3 surface contacts that had been moving on parallel tracks shifted course almost at the same moment. Their headings angled inward, their speed increased, and their formation grew tighter. This did not look random. It was Christmas Day, a time when attention is naturally divided and watch rotations can be lighter. Across the world, people were focused elsewhere, and Venezuela seemed to understand the timing. Inside the ship's operations center, the report was short and clear. 3 Venezuelan naval vessels, coordinated course change, closing distance. There were no raised voices and no dramatic reaction, only confirmation. At sea, intent is not always spoken over the radio. Sometimes it is shown through movement. These vessels were not simply passing by. They were not keeping a comfortable distance. They were moving directly toward the U.S. Navy ship's path. The American response came quickly, but carefully. No turnaway, no change in speed, no sharp maneuver. The ship held its course. That decision mattered. In international waters, predictability can be a powerful advantage. The first side to react too strongly can give the other side control of the moment. The captain knew that. The Venezuelan commanders watching their own screens likely knew it as well. The distance kept shrinking. 24 nautical miles. 22. 20. The Venezuelan vessels sent no message. No AIS signal. No bridge-to-bridge call. No explanation. Just 3 steel hulls moving with clear purpose. The first radio call went out. Venezuelan naval vessels. This is a United States Navy ship operating in international waters. State your intentions. No response. The vessels kept coming. A second call followed, this time in Spanish. You are conducting unsafe maneuvering. Alter course immediately. Still nothing. By then, the situation had become hard to dismiss. 3 coordinated vessels, complete radio silence, and a direct approach toward a U.S. Navy ship during a major holiday. This was not simple confusion at sea. It appeared to be a carefully timed test. Inside the operations center, sensors were brought into use quietly. Long-range optics focused on the approaching hulls. Every bearing change, every increase in speed, every second of silence was recorded and time-stamped. The American ship still did not move off course. No showmanship, no dramatic display, just discipline. Because in moments like this, especially when the other side may be counting on distraction, the strongest response is not overreaction. It is calm control. And as the Venezuelan vessels continued their approach on December 25th, one thing became clear to everyone watching the screens. This was not about navigation. It was about who would yield first. The distance kept closing. 20 nautical miles, then 19, then 18. From the outside, the scene may not have looked dramatic. There was no sudden burst of speed, no erratic turning, no obvious spectacle, just 3 Venezuelan naval vessels maintaining steady movement while subtly tightening their approach angle. It was controlled, careful, the kind of maneuver that can appear explainable right up until the moment it no longer can. Inside the operations center, the tactical picture became clearer. The lead Venezuelan vessel remained on a direct intercept path. The other 2 shifted outward by a few degrees, spreading laterally while still maintaining forward pressure. To civilian traffic, that might have looked meaningless. To a naval watch team, it meant everything. They were not fully surrounding the U.S. Navy ship, not yet. But they were reducing its maneuvering options and narrowing the time available for a decision. The American response remained unchanged. Course steady, speed steady, posture neutral. That restraint was intentional. In international waters, every movement can be interpreted. A turn away could be described as backing down. A speed increase could be framed as escalation. Legally and tactically, the strongest position was to remain steady. The Venezuelan vessels continued closing, 17 nautical miles. No radio traffic, no courtesy call, no navigational explanation. The silence itself had become a message. The officer of the deck ordered another hail. Venezuelan naval vessels, you are closing distance on a United States Navy ship. Recommend immediate course alteration to avoid unsafe conditions. Only static came back. The closest point of approach recalculated again, 5.2 nautical miles. That number drew quiet attention across the watch floor. Below 5 miles, intent becomes harder to explain away. Below 3, it becomes almost impossible. Electronic support systems continued logging passively. No interference, no warnings, just listening. Radar sweeps from the Venezuelan vessels appeared from time to time. Low power, surface search mode. They were watching, measuring, and adjusting. Long-range optics zoomed in further. Deck activity was now visible. Sailors were topside, helmets on. Several figures gathered near the forward mounts. No one moved to crew the ship's armament, but no one was treating the moment as routine either. The captain watched in silence. He had seen this kind of pattern before, not in these waters and not on this date, but the method was familiar. Pressure kept just close enough to test a response, yet controlled enough to deny clear intent. 16 nautical miles. The lead Venezuelan vessel increased speed slightly, only by 2 knots. Moments later, the other two matched it. The change was small, but it shortened the timeline. CPA now 4.1 nautical miles, the operations center reported. At that distance, the encounter was no longer theoretical. A small error in speed or angle could quickly remove the margin for correction. Everyone in the room understood that the timing was not accidental. Christmas Day meant lighter watch rotations, reduced public attention, and a carefully chosen window. The U.S. Navy ship did not respond to the speed increase with any visible change. Instead, the captain gave a quiet order. Shift to heightened awareness. Bring additional sensors online. No alarms sounded. No broad announcements were made. From the outside, the ship looked exactly the same. Inside, it was preparing. On the flight deck, the aviation crew moved calmly but quickly. Power was connected. Systems began warming. Crews strapped in. It was not yet a launch order, but readiness was no longer just a possibility. Inside the operations center, watch teams tracked every bearing change with extreme precision. The Venezuelan vessels continued holding formation, still closing, still silent. CPA now 3.6 nautical miles. That number changed the weight of the room. Below 3 miles, explanations begin to vanish. Below 3 miles, events can move from routine records to history in seconds. Still, the American ship held its line. This was not stubbornness, it was discipline. The goal was not to create a confrontation. The goal was to make the other side decide the next step while every movement was being documented. The pressure had already been applied. Now the question was simple. Would Venezuela push further, or would they realize how visible their move had become? When the range dropped below 3 nautical miles, the situation entered a new phase. At that distance, intent could no longer be brushed aside as coincidence or poor navigation. Every adjustment mattered. Every knot of speed carried weight. Every second was recorded. Inside the operations center, the atmosphere was quiet, but tense. Watchstanders spoke in short, exact updates, eyes fixed on tactical displays and optical feeds. CPA now 2.9 nautical miles, closing. The captain listened without reacting. He did not need more data. He needed the right moment. In modern naval operations, the response is not always about being first. It is about choosing the exact second when action carries the most meaning. The Venezuelan vessels maintained formation. The lead ship stayed close to a direct intercept path, while the 2 others continued applying side pressure, narrowing the available maneuvering space without crossing into an obvious escalation. It was calculated pressure. The captain made his call. "Execute presence measures," he said calmly. The words were simple, but the meaning was clear. Inside the operations center, the shift happened immediately and under control. Active sensors came online. Precision tracking remained limited by design, while high-resolution optics fixed firmly on the lead Venezuelan vessel. Electronic monitoring systems stayed quiet, available but unused. This was not a display of threat. It was a way to remove uncertainty. On the flight deck, the helicopter crew received the order they had been expecting. Engines came alive. Rotors began to turn. The aircraft lifted smoothly, rising just enough to clear the ship before settling into a low-controlled orbit off the starboard side. No dramatic climb, no sharp maneuver, just a visible signal. From above, the helicopter's sensor suite activated fully. Infrared imaging cut through distance and glare. Electro-optical zoom delivered a clear view of activity on the Venezuelan decks. Heat signatures, movement, bridge activity, and crew positions were all captured, time-stamped, and geolocated. The helicopter moved laterally while keeping a professional offset, close enough to be impossible to ignore, far enough to remain measured. Then came the next signal. A steady green optical marker appeared across the bridge windows of the lead Venezuelan ship. It caused no harm, but its meaning was impossible to miss. Inside the Venezuelan bridge, the reaction was immediate. On the helicopter's feed, crew members briefly stopped, then began moving with purpose. One sailor lifted binoculars, another stepped back toward the interior. The green reflection was visible across the glass. At the same moment, the helicopter transmitted on an open maritime frequency. Venezuelan naval vessel. This is a United States Navy aircraft. You are conducting unsafe maneuvering in international waters. Your actions are being recorded. Alter course immediately. The message was repeated in Spanish. This time, the reply did not come through the radio. It appeared on the tactical display. A small but important change showed up almost immediately. Contact reducing speed. 26 knots became 24, then 22. Seconds later, the two Venezuelan vessels on the sides began to slow as well. Their wakes shortened as engine power eased and the tight approach pattern began to loosen. There was no sharp turn, no sudden withdrawal, just a careful step back. The helicopter stayed in position, sensors focused, optical markers steady. It did not chase. It did not move closer than needed. It simply remained there, watching, recording, and waiting. At 2.7 nautical miles, the lead Venezuelan ship adjusted course slightly. Only a few degrees, but that was enough. It was no longer moving directly into the U.S. Navy ship's path. Inside the operations center, the update came in calmly. Contact is no longer lowering CPA. That was the turning point. The challenge had reached its peak, and then it began to fade. The helicopter made one final wide pass, slow and deliberate, confirming the change in posture. Then it turned back toward the ship, climbed smoothly, and returned to the flight deck. The wheels touched down, the rotors slowed, and the aircraft was secured. The U.S. Navy ship had never changed course. It had never changed speed. Venezuelan vessels were still visible on radar and still close enough to be seen, but they were no longer closing in. Their movement had shifted from pressure to observation. No dramatic confrontation followed. No loud public gesture was needed. The result was already clear. The U.S. Navy had not relied on intimidation. It had used presence, discipline, and documentation to make the situation unmistakable. In modern naval encounters, control is not always shown through dramatic action. Sometimes it is shown by the side that stays steady, records everything, and makes the other side understand that every move has been seen. Inside the operations center, the first clear sign was not visual. It was mathematical. CPA increasing. That single update confirmed what the crew had already sensed. The geometry had changed. On the radar display, the lead Venezuelan vessel's track began to drift away from the U.S. Navy ship's heading. It was only a slight change, but it altered the entire encounter. The two flanking vessels mirrored the adjustment, widening their spacing and letting the pressure pattern dissolve. Their speed told the rest of the story. The lead vessel dropped below 20 knots, then 19, before settling into a steady transit pace. The other two followed the same pattern. On the optical feeds, deck activity also began to change. Crew members who had been standing near forward deck positions stepped back. Helmets came off. Some sailors leaned against the railings, their posture noticeably more relaxed. The decision had been made. On the bridge of the U.S. Navy ship, there was no visible celebration and no order to pursue. The ship continued straight ahead, engines holding the same steady rhythm, as if nothing unusual had happened. That restraint was intentional. The goal had never been to embarrass the other side or turn the moment into a larger incident. The goal was to end the challenge without creating a new one. Inside the operations center, risk levels were quietly reduced. Sensors remained active, but the atmosphere began to ease. The closest point of approach continued to widen. 4 nautical miles, then 5. The Venezuelan vessels remained in the area, still observing from a distance, but their role had changed completely. They were no longer setting the terms, they were responding to them, and that difference mattered. The helicopter footage was already being processed and archived. Every frame was matched with radar data and navigation logs. If the encounter was ever questioned, the record would be clear. The U.S. Navy ship had maintained lawful transit. The Venezuelan vessels had approached in a coordinated way, then adjusted course after direct signaling and visible documentation. Out on deck, sailors returned to their routines. There were no announcements over the ship's systems, no visible display of relief, and no break in professionalism. The watch continued as normal, because that is how these moments are handled. In a way, nothing extraordinary had happened. And that was exactly the point. Encounters like this are becoming part of the modern maritime environment. Naval forces operate closer than before. Political messages are sent through movement instead of speeches. Pressure is applied quietly, tested carefully, and then withdrawn just as quietly. What made this moment important was not how it began, but how it ended. No force was used, no clear boundary was crossed, no one lost control. The Venezuelan Navy had tested the edge of the situation, and the U.S. Navy answered without turning it into a larger incident. When that pressure met calm resolve instead of an emotional reaction, it began to collapse on its own. By the time the distance opened beyond 8 nautical miles, the encounter was effectively finished. The Venezuelan vessels were still visible on radar, still watching from a distance, but they were no longer shaping the situation. The sea returned to its earlier quiet. The horizon looked the same. But for the people watching the displays, reading the numbers, and measuring every second, the message was clear. At sea, strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is measured in a few degrees of heading, a few knots of speed, and the confidence to hold course when the other side expects hesitation. And on December 25th, 2025, that confidence ended the challenge without force being used. By the time the range opened beyond 10 nautical miles, the outcome had already been decided. The 3 Venezuelan naval vessels were still on radar, but they no longer controlled the encounter. Their tracks had shifted into parallel movement, no longer cutting toward the U.S. Navy ship's path. What began as a coordinated approach had become distant observation. To someone outside naval operations, it may have looked like almost nothing happened. No dramatic maneuver, no public announcement, no obvious moment that would dominate headlines. But in modern maritime operations, the most important outcomes are not always defined by spectacle. They are defined by who controls the pace, who keeps the record, and who is forced to step back. On December 25th, Venezuela appeared to test a familiar idea, that timing could create opportunity. A global holiday reduced attention. The expectation that a U.S. Navy ship might choose avoidance over resolve. That assumption proved wrong. The American response was not aggressive. It did not rely on dramatic threats or unnecessary displays. It relied on procedure, documentation, and restraint applied with precision. Every movement was logged. Every course change was recorded. Every second was preserved through radar, optics, and flight data. If the encounter was ever questioned later, the record would be clear. The U.S. Navy ship maintained lawful transit, while the Venezuelan vessels applied pressure and then chose to step back. That matters because situations like this are no longer rare. Across the world's oceans, navies increasingly operate in the gray zone. Not open conflict, not normal peace, but a tense space where pressure is applied carefully, without crossing the threshold into something larger. In that environment, the goal is not always to overpower the other side. The goal is often to push them into a decision they cannot easily explain or defend. That is exactly what happened here. Venezuela could have continued closing. It could have forced a tighter encounter. It could have pushed the situation further. But doing so would have meant taking responsibility for the consequences legally, politically, and militarily. Instead, it pulled back. The U.S. Navy did not prevail by overpowering its opponent. It prevailed by making further pressure unnecessary, visible, and hard to justify. It held course, stayed professional, and refused to give the other side control of the story. That message reaches far beyond the Caribbean. It shows that international waters are governed by rules, not intimidation. It shows that timing and distraction do not create exceptions. And it shows that pressure applied without accountability can be answered with calm discipline, not overreaction. Inside the ship, the watch continued. Crews rotated, logs were finalized, the helicopter detachment completed post-flight checks. The mission itself never changed because it never needed to. Transit, presence, stability. This is what maritime power looks like in the 21st century, not spectacle for its own sake. Not restraint from weakness, but control rooted in discipline. The next encounter may not happen on a holiday. It may not involve the same countries, but the pattern will be familiar. A close approach, silence, pressure, and one critical moment where someone has to decide whether to continue or step back. The question is not whether these challenges will continue. They will. The real question is how they should be answered. Should the United States respond more firmly to challenges at sea? Or is restraint the smarter tool in a world where every move is recorded, replayed, and judged? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this breakdown was valuable, subscribe for more real-world naval encounters analyzed through modern doctrine and operational behavior. Because far from headlines and holiday celebrations, the most important decisions are often made quietly. One course line, one heading change, and one moment of resolve at a time.